While the world obsesses over oil shocks, semiconductor bans, and artificial intelligence races, a quieter shift is unfolding beneath the noise. It involves no technology, no sanctions, and no emergency summits. It involves wheat, a staple so ordinary it rarely makes headlines, yet so essential that nations have gone to war over it. Canada's wheat trade is beginning to tell a story few are paying attention to. Not an agricultural story, but a geopolitical one. As supply chains fracture and trust erodes, food security is re-emerging as a currency of power. In recent years, trade flows have started to reflect this reality, adjusting away from assumptions and toward new calculations. For decades, global influence was measured through energy dominance, systems, and military reach. Wheat seemed irrelevant by comparison. But power does not survive on microchips alone. It survives on calories. And in an era of climate volatility, export controls, and stockpiling, reliable food suppliers matter more than ever. Canada's wheat is drifting away from Washington's gravitational pull and edging closer to Beijing's strategic orbit. There were no announcements, no realignments, just contracts, shipments, and changing incentives. So the question isn't whether this shift matters. The question is why it's happening now, and what it reveals about how power is redistributed. Wheat is often treated as background noise in history, something passive that simply moves with markets. In reality, it has quietly shaped alliances, stabilized currencies, and determined who survives moments of global stress. After the Second World War, wheat became one of the most powerful instruments of American influence, flowing outward through food aid programs that tied recovery to political alignment. Grain shipments rebuilt Europe, anchored the dollar system, and created long-term dependence disguised as generosity. During the Cold War, wheat turned into leverage. Export licenses, embargoes, and preferential access were used to reward allies and punish rivals without firing a shot. When oil shocked economies, wheat kept societies functioning. When currencies weakened, food imports propped up legitimacy. Control over calories translated into control over stability. In North America, agricultural exports helped bind the transatlantic order together. Canada and the United States emerged as reliable breadbaskets, not just feeding populations, but underwriting global confidence. Wheat smoothed volatility in ways markets rarely acknowledge, acting as a silent stabilizer beneath louder power struggles. Publicly, wheat looked boring. Privately, it was strategic insurance. Unlike oil, it did not generate headlines or sudden price spikes that demanded attention, but in crises it proved more decisive. You can ration fuel. You cannot ration hunger without consequences. Understanding wheat as power changes how trade flows are interpreted. It reveals that food has always been geopolitical, even when treated as merely agricultural. And with this lens in place, Canada's historically predictable alignment begins to make sense. That alignment shaped decades of trust, pricing, logistics, and political direction. For most of the modern era, Canada's wheat did not wander. It flowed south, predictably and efficiently, into a trade system built around Washington's economic gravity. Shared standards, integrated logistics, and deeply synchronized policy frameworks made the United States the natural center of Canadian agricultural trade. Geography reinforced trust, and trust reduced friction. This model delivered stability. Prices were transparent, contracts reliable, and disputes manageable inside Western-led institutions. Canadian farmers operated inside a familiar ecosystem where rules rarely changed and political alignment acted as insurance. Efficiency became the story, and dependency stayed invisible. But stability has a cost. When one market dominates, optionality disappears. As global demand patterns shifted and non-Western consumers grew more influential, Canada's trade architecture remained anchored to assumptions forged decades earlier. What once felt like seamless integration now resembles constraint. The Washington-centered model, optimized for yesterday's world, a unipolar system with predictable flows and shared strategic priorities. Today's reality looks different. Trade is no longer just about distance or price, but about resilience, diversification, and leverage. Canada's wheat did not suddenly abandon this system. It simply began to test its boundaries. And when those boundaries appeared rigid, alternatives became visible. To understand where those alternatives lead, the lens must now shift east toward a player that never treated food as ordinary commerce. This slow reassessment marked the first quiet signal that the old anchor might no longer hold in a changing world of global trade dynamics. For China, food security is not an abstract policy goal. It is a historical obsession shaped by famine, demographic pressure, and political memory. Feeding the population has always been tied to legitimacy, and shortages have repeatedly destabilized regimes. This history informs Beijing's modern strategy. Over the past decade, China has treated wheat imports less as market transactions and more as insurance policies. Climate volatility, water scarcity, and geopolitical tension all feed into the same calculation. Dependence is risk. Rather than rely on a single supplier or bloc, Beijing quietly diversified sources, built reserves, and secured long-term contracts. This approach contrasts sharply with Western market thinking, which prioritizes efficiency, spot pricing, and short-term optimization. China plans in decades, not quarters. It accepts higher costs today to reduce vulnerability tomorrow. There is no ideology in this calculus, only survival economics. Canada fits neatly into this logic. It offers scale, reliability, political stability, and distance from regional flashpoints. Canadian wheat represents diversification without chaos, supply without unpredictability. From Beijing's perspective, it is not about replacing partners, but balancing them. What looks incremental from the outside is deliberate inside the strategy. Each shipment reduces exposure, each contract widens optionality. And as these decisions compound, they begin to reshape trade flows in ways markets only notice after the fact. Recent disruptions, export controls, and climate shocks have only reinforced this mindset, turning caution into doctrine and diversification into national priority. That is why Beijing's food policy evolves quietly, without slogans, revealing its impact only when the balance has already shifted. The strategy matures patiently, unnoticed, until dependencies elsewhere suddenly become liabilities in global markets today. Trade data rarely tells dramatic stories at first glance. There are no speeches in spreadsheets, no ideology in shipping manifests, yet recent wheat numbers point in a clear direction. Over the past few years, China's share of Canadian wheat exports has quietly increased, while traditional Western flows have flattened, slowed, or encountered friction from logistics, regulation, and politics. This is not a surge, it is a drift. Contracts signed without press releases, cargo ships leaving ports without headlines. In a world trained to look for shocks, this kind of movement is easy to miss, but markets often adjust long before governments acknowledge change. Canadian wheat shipments to China now reflect a deeper pattern of diversification. Beijing is spreading risk. Canada is responding to demand. Meanwhile, established trade routes tied to older assumptions show signs of strain. Freight costs fluctuate, standards diverge. Political uncertainty adds friction where predictability once ruled. What makes this moment significant is not volume alone, but direction. Trade is reallocating quietly, guided by incentives rather than ideology. No sanctions forced this shift. No alliances were broken. It happened because buyers and sellers recalculated risk in an unstable world. This is how realignments begin, not with declarations, but with invoices. And if wheat, one of the most fundamental commodities on Earth, is already moving ahead of politics, it raises a larger question. What happens to alliances built on trust when markets start voting differently? Quietly, steadily, the data whispers change before leaders are ready to listen to it. For Canada, this shift creates an uncomfortable tension. Security, intelligence, and defense remain firmly aligned with Washington. Economic gravity, however, is becoming harder to ignore. Wheat sits at the center of that dilemma, exposing the gap between values-based narratives and material realities. Official language emphasizes trusted partners and shared principles, but farmers do not trade in abstractions. They trade in prices, reliability, and demand. When new buyers offer stability in uncertain markets, economics begins to challenge politics. This does not signal betrayal. It signals adaptation. Middle powers like Canada increasingly operate in this gray zone. Choosing sides outright carries risk. Refusing to adapt carries greater risk. The result is hedging. Trade flows diversify quietly, while security commitments remain unchanged. This balancing act defines modern geopolitics more than public statements ever will. The tension is felt far from capitals. It appears in prairie towns where harvests depend on global demand, in ports where shipments must move regardless of diplomatic mood, in rural economies where access to markets determines survival. Canada's wheat trade reveals this reality with unusual clarity. The country is not pivoting dramatically. It is recalibrating, navigating between alliance loyalty and economic necessity, between moral framing and survival economics. This is not a uniquely Canadian story. It is a preview. As power diffuses and certainty erodes, more nations will face the same quiet pressure to adapt, and the choices they make, grain by grain, will reshape the global order. Food, often overlooked, becomes the pressure point where strategy, livelihood, and geopolitics collide first in moments of uncertainty, instability, transition, globally. Wheat is not the story, it is the signal. What it reveals is a new geography of global influence built on fragmentation rather than dominance. The old world was centralized, with a handful of powers controlling flows of energy, finance, and food. Stability came from scale and control. Today, influence looks different. Nations pursue redundancy instead of efficiency, multiple suppliers instead of single anchors. Trade routes branch outward, not inward. This is multipolarity expressed through supply chains rather than speeches. The popular belief is that power shifts announce themselves with crises, wars, or dramatic realignments. History suggests otherwise. The most durable transitions happen quietly, contract by contract, port by port. By the time politics reacts, markets have already adapted. Wheat shows this clearly. No single shipment changes the system, but thousands of small adjustments slowly redraw the map. Resilience replaces loyalty. Optionality replaces dependence. What looks like noise is pattern. What looks temporary is structural. And if food, the most basic input of civilization, is already reorganizing itself around risk and redundancy, the implications stretch far beyond agriculture. The real question now is not whether this shift is happening. It is where it spreads next, and how many other supply chains are already moving beneath the surface, unseen. Quiet transitions often define eras long before leaders recognize the ground has shifted. Canada's wheat trade is not about crops or seasons. It is about how power now moves, quietly, incrementally, and without permission from headlines. While attention fixates on technology wars and military posture, influence is being rebalanced through logistics, contracts, and food security. This is the deeper lesson. Global power no longer shifts only through conquest or collapse. It reallocates through risk management. Nations hedge, diversify, and ensure themselves against uncertainty. Food becomes strategy. Trade becomes foresight. Canada's position illustrates this transformation. There is no dramatic pivot, no rejection of alliances. There is adjustment. Wheat flows respond to incentives, not speeches. Survival economics outruns ideology. What looks mundane is often decisive. Grain shipments do not trend on social media, but they keep societies stable. They determine who eats, who exports inflation, and who absorbs shock. If wheat can realign quietly, so can fertilizers, rare earths, shipping lanes, and data cables. The future of power may already be shifting through the most ordinary inputs of modern life. The real question is no longer where power announces itself, but where it is quietly reorganizing next. Those signals matter most precisely because they escape attention until consequences become unavoidable for everyone involved across markets, states, and generations to come.